Welcome to the Who, What, Why podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Schechtman. Back in December, the United States suffered its first deadly attack on U.S. soil since 9/11. It was planned abroad, but no, it wasn't from a virus. Last week, the FBI said that data from the cell phone of a Saudi Air Force trainee who killed 3 U.S. soldiers and wounded 8 others at a Navy base in Florida back on December 6th confirmed that it was an act of foreign planned terrorism. Was this a lone act of terror, or was it an extension of Saudi state policy? The idea of nations projecting both hard and soft power around the world is not a new idea. It was the bulwark of U.S. policy during the Cold War, and over the past several years, China has done it via its Belt and Road project. Less known, though, is the way in which Saudi Arabia and its particular brand of religious Islam has made it an instrument of state policy. Almost invisible until 9/11, the Saudis had a complex infrastructure supported by its oil wealth to spread Wahhabism throughout Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. And today, while the Saudi brand may be tarnished, its oil revenues depleted, its influence and legacy are still an ongoing threat. We're going to talk about that in this week's podcast with my guest, Kritika Vagwa. She's an award-winning journalist who covers Indonesia for The Guardian and has reported widely throughout Asia for publications including The Atlantic, the New York Review of Books, the Financial Times, and the New Republic. She's a graduate of Harvard and a Fulbright Scholar at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. She's the author of The Call Inside the Global Saudi Religious Project, and it is my pleasure to welcome Kritika Vagwa here to the Who, What, Why podcast. Kritika, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited.
This project goes back to really the 60s and 70s. Talk about what it was, how it got started.
So Saudi Arabia, which many people may not know, is a really young country. It only became a country in 1932. Saudi soft power is also a relatively speaking recent phenomenon. It started in the 1960s when a Saudi king named King Faisal became the monarch of this kind of young country. And unlike his predecessors, he was really globally minded. And he came to power during this kind of post-war, mid-century era when there were all these new Asian and African nations. And, there were a lot of global alliances shifting and forming at the time. So he had this idea for a foreign policy for Saudi Arabia, which is, of course, the birthplace of Islam, to have a foreign policy driven by Islamic solidarity, or al-Tadamun al-Islami. And because of its unique heritage as the birthplace of Islam, he thought that Saudi could be a natural partner for a whole bunch of new countries, from Nigeria to Indonesia. And he started cultivating relationships with religious leaders all over the Muslim world. About 10 years, less than 10 years after he embarked on this kind of ambitious people-to-people exchanges, Saudi Arabia became really rich with oil in the way that we think of it today. And that's because the Arab-Israeli War. There was a really massive oil embargo in 1973, which meant that Saudi Arabia, which had already, started having pretty serious drilling and so on and had Aramco there, it really became flush with oil money. The profits quintupled. So combining this new oil money with King Faisal's vision for Saudi-led Muslim world led to this soft power project, which impacted so many countries.
And talk about what the object was. So often with soft power, we see it being about that nation's influence and about the broader projection of its foreign policy. Because this was religious in nature, talk a little bit about the nexus between religion and national power and how the two were tied together.
So, spreading Wahhabism, which is their state religion, became an important part of their foreign policy in the way that spreading democracy was and is a tentpole of American foreign policy. And the reason for this is that the Saudi royal family, the House of Saud, has a centuries-old pact with the Wahhabi clerical establishment dating back to the 18th century, where their royal family promised to protect this preacher named Wahhab and his school of clerics if they gave their royal family religious legitimacy in the Arabian Peninsula. So because of this old pact, which is still in place today, the Saudi state, what we might call a secular state, even though it's kind of theocratic state, has uptaken the clerics' goals of spreading Wahhabi Islam worldwide. So, on one hand, Saudi foreign policy was driven by kind of generalized solidarity with Muslims, but another part, because their government's legitimacy comes from religious clerics, it also means spreading their very specific kind of religion to the countries that they work in.
And one of the things about this project is how sophisticated it was, how much infrastructure was involved, to the point of setting up clerics in all of these countries and really using all of the financial resources to really ingrain itself in so many different places at the same time.
Yeah, that was one of my surprising takeaways from the research, which was that it wasn't this kind of nefarious, like, funneling dark money everywhere. At the start, at least, it was really based on personal exchanges, cultivating relationships, often at the highest levels of Saudi Arabia. Like the king himself, King Faisal, and also King Fahd, really made it a point to identify potential leaders, especially in countries like Indonesia and Nigeria that were geographically far off. So I think that's what contributed to the success of this project, which was by no means guaranteed, because his ideology was, in many places, quite extreme.
The other thing is how long this went on, that it really went on for decades, and how wide and how far-flung the Muslim world is.
I mean, the Muslim world is 1.8 billion people and counting. And, Islam is the fastest growing religion today. And the countries I picked are nevertheless outside of what we, definitely as Americans, tend to think of as the Muslim world. They're all outside the Middle East. The countries I've reported from are Nigeria, Kosovo in the Balkans, and Indonesia, which are really far-flung. They're on 3 different continents, but all are basically Muslim-majority democracies. And I think that this big sweep of the project is what made it really interesting to study in Gestalt.
Talk a little bit about what this religious belief was, what Wahhabism is all about, and how it was being proselytized.
Yeah, so Wahhabism is named after its founder, who was a very austere preacher in the Arabian desert named Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab. And basically he looked around him and he felt that the Muslims of Arabia had lost their way. They were doing all these kinds of practices that were not part of true Islam. They were worshiping at shrines, venerating saints, singing, celebrating the Prophet's birthday. He thought all of this was really off the beaten path. And in this way, he wasn't, not to belabor the comparison, he wasn't too far off from a Luther. He wanted to reform the practices around him. He had a very austere conception of what Islam really was. What was different for him was that he authorized the use of violence to propagate his vision of what Islam was. And he was kind of a Unitarian. He really believed that monotheism, there's no God but Allah, was the start and finish point of Islam, that everything else around it was kind of deviant and people who followed these other kinds of Islam should be excommunicated, basically. So from the very beginning, Wahhabism was very combative. It was kind of militaristic. They destroyed shrines, really ancient historic sites. And, Wahhabism in practice today is very literalistic religion. A key Wahhabi belief, for example, is that the earth is at the center of the solar system and not the sun. Wahhabi clerics in Saudi give a lot of kind of, to us, silly-sounding fatwas to this day, like one that says people shouldn't take photos with cats. And just like all kinds of little things. They're very concerned with like day-to-day life and daily behaviors, and they're very literal and austere conception of what Islam is. That being said, when this religion was exported worldwide, it often ended up as a discrete movement called Salafism and not Wahhabism per se, because Wahhabism is so site-specific to Saudi Arabia. It really involves this pact with the Saudi royal family and obedience to the Saudi royal family. It doesn't really make sense in too many other countries. So what happened when they brought this religion worldwide was that it created a related movement called it encouraged Salafis who kind of end up in the same place as Wahhabis, but from a different starting point. Their starting point is that we should emulate the first few generations of Muslims and go back to the earliest Islam, and also, again, reject all kinds of innovations and folk practices.
And what was the biggest appeal? Why was it so appealing to people?
One imam who I count as a friend now in Kosovo, who studied in Medina on a Saudi scholarship, said that growing up in the former Yugoslavia and living through the war, he had a lot of questions. His religious education was really patchy. And he said, Salafis had answers. I had a lot of questions and Salafis had answers. The thing about both Wahhabism and Salafism is that because they're so literalistic and because they rely on a few key texts, like the Book of Monotheism or the medieval theologian Ibn Taymiyyah, they do have these kind of cut and dry answers. They have a canon you can memorize. They tend to quote the same sayings of the Prophet. And this kind of uniform, simple to understand ideology is really appealing to a lot of people, especially if they come from kind of unstable contexts, which a lot of people in the post-colonial and some post-war contexts were.
You talk about how it really thrived and reached its peak, perhaps, during the 70s with all the infusion of so much Saudi oil money. What happened in the late 70s as the Islamic Revolution came to be?
Yeah, so that would be, of course, the 1979 revolution in Iran, and that really kind of exploded this project that was already growing in scale and ambition. But then it became kind of this arms race or competition for hearts and minds. The Iranian Revolution really freaked out Saudi Arabia because, first of all, it was Shia and not Sunni. Second of all, it was a popular revolt against monarchy, basically. And both of those things are terrifying to the Sunni monarchy that ruled Saudi Arabia. So the Iranian Revolution happened, and a lot of people in the Muslim world thought this was amazing. They didn't see it as a Shia victory per se. They were really inspired by what they had managed to do and installed this like Islamist regime. So a lot of people even started converting to Shiism in countries like the ones I visited. And Saudi really ramped up their proselytization around that time to counter what they felt as this like Iranian bid for leadership of the whole Islamic world. That's not the only thing that happened in 1979, of course. That same year, Islamists within the kingdom occupied the Grand Mosque in Mecca in what was called Juhayman's Revolt, and they criticized the royal family for deviating from the Islamic path, and then they said they'd kind of strayed, and that really struck fear into their hearts too. So both domestically and internationally, 1979 had a lot of pressures on Saudi's image. And then the last thing that happened in 79 was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So those three things combined really pushed the Saudi project into high gear.
And one of the things that it seemed to have done when it went into high gear is become so much more violent.
Well, yes and no. Saudi didn't necessarily want to support terrorists per se. Nevertheless, it's become a part of all three countries I reported from, that a small fringe of Salafis become Salafi jihadists. In Nigeria, they become Boko Haram. In Indonesia, they become the Al-Qaeda affiliate, Jamaah Islamiyah. In Kosovo, several hundred people went to join ISIS. And I don't think this was by Saudi design per se, but the fact that their ideology has this real gray area between non-violent intolerance and violent intolerance. And Saudi will say we're only pushing, or, agents of Saudi proselytization will say we're only pushing the Salafism or Wahhabism. It's not violent. But the fact remains that if it endorses things like intolerance, excommunication, deviance, and so on, a vulnerable minority of these people inevitably in all these countries become terrorists. So that's the catch-22 that Saudi found itself in the 90s and increasingly in the post-9/11 era.
And how did 9/11 change this?
Most people wouldn't have really even known what Islamic fundamentalism was until 9/11. It's just hard to believe, I guess, because it's such a big feature of our world map today. But 9/11 really put, quote unquote, Islamic terror on the map and made Al-Qaeda a household term. And it really ramped. And of course, 15 of the 19 Twin Tower hijackers were Saudi nationals. And it was a PR disaster for Saudi Arabia. And Al-Qaeda, of course, funded by Osama bin Laden, who was from an influential family in Saudi Arabia, but it then turned against the kingdom. So it was kind of an embarrassing and awful incident, and it really turned up the heat on their financial outflows. So what happened is, even in these kind of nonviolent contexts that I reported from, after 2001, everyone told me that the taps kind of dried up and Saudi wasn't able to freely give money anymore because there was so much scrutiny on what they were doing abroad.
As you look back at the legacy of this, in your view, what good came out of it?
Something cool that happened, I think, was that it empowered a lot of post-colonial Islamic intellectuals. I mean, some of the people I spoke to, especially in places like Indonesia, they recount this world of the 60s and 70s, going to these massive pan-Islamic conferences and youth leagues and so on with great fondness. And I do think that was really cool that it was facilitated for them, regardless of the end results. And, and it made Saudi into kind of an intellectual destination in the Islamic world where it hadn't really been one before. I mean, if you really think about history, the intellectual capitals of the Islamic world were places like Istanbul, Damascus, Cairo. Saudi was never on the map, and this project really put them on the map because they invested so much in education and so on. And then I think, Saudi facilitation did build a lot of schools and universities in places where there were not enough development opportunities at all. And there are plenty of people who took the free Saudi education, maybe even the scholarship, got an education, maybe learned Arabic, and then just went on with their lives. They didn't become fundamentalists. They didn't become radicals. And, in a lot of the countries, these were invaluable charities. And, of course, Saudi charity has also been a really big part of places like Bosnia and Kosovo, Aceh after the tsunami, and so on. So there's plenty of, what I think are viable Saudi charity efforts, too.
And how much of this infrastructure is still in place today? There's certainly less money supporting it and perhaps less desire to support it. Where does it stand today?
Yeah, as you said, we're kind of dealing with the legacy effects today. Some of the brick and mortar things that they built in the peak proselytization era are still standing. So like the Saudi University in Jakarta, Saudi religious attachés offices, this big university in Medina, they're all still there. They're also standing. There's just substantially fewer resources dedicated to them. But also something I write is that, even if Saudis stop spending any money on proselytization today, their effects would still be considerable because in all these countries, Salafis are standing on their own feet now, and the internet has been a big democratizing force, and they no longer need active Saudi charity to sustain these communities. So I think we're going to be dealing with the legacy effects for a while to come, but definitely between Vision 2030 of the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and the oil crash and COVID-19, it's going to accelerate this trend we've been seeing of lower and lower resources committed to this project.
How much is Vision 2030 and that project an outgrowth in some respects of what this was?
I mean, Vision 2030 is really a break with a lot of stuff that's happened in Saudi Arabia. MBS has been testing this pact that I talked about with the Wahhabi clerics to an unprecedented degree. And it's clear that the reputation Saudi Arabia has acquired in the last couple of decades as this fountainhead of terrorism and so on is it really affects him, and he's very conscious about it, and he makes a lot of big statements in the public sphere and to Western media, like, we're going to stand about extremism, Saudi's going back to its roots, like, we don't stand for extremists. I mean, it's hard to say what the end result is going to be because we know he's no defender of human rights. That being said, the fact that he's conscious about this kind of religious extremism coming out of Saudi Arabia means that he has decreased the resources available to the Dawah ministry. He has arrested quite a lot of Wahhabi clerics and kind of reined them in. He's passed a lot of laws inside the kingdom that would really antagonize the clerics, and they can't do anything about it because he's really centralized so much power. And in Vision 2030, only one of the 13 priorities on the blueprint have anything to do with religion, and they only refer to the Hajj pilgrimage and the Umrah pilgrimage. So he's really trying to shift gears and show a new face to Saudi Arabia, like economy and tourism and so on. And it's impossible to tell at this stage, because it's so early, what the end result of that will be. But I think his uneasiness at the public image is already having pretty significant effects.
And around the world, in the places where this project was so pervasive, is there still simmering resentment to what transpired? We see now, for example, with China and Belt and Road, that there's this resentment welling up. Is there still resentment for what went on?
Yes and no. I mean, I think that a lot of people on a grassroots level in the Muslim world do fundamentally like Saudi Arabia and hope to go there just because, like, it is the place you do Hajj and pilgrimage and it's the birthplace of Islam. But I think, especially as Saudi Arabia's human rights record has become more and more kind of hard to ignore between Jamal Khashoggi and the war in Yemen and things like that, there's been a growing chorus of people who are skeptical of Saudi influence. And, you know, I lived in Indonesia for several years as a journalist. They have their own thriving discourse of Arabisasi, or Arabization, this idea that Saudi Arabia has corrupted their religious traditions and so on. And the same kind of backlash can be found in a lot of countries. But, you know, I would say that the backlash tends to come from what you might call the liberal or progressive wing of the religious establishments in these countries, or from secularists. And there's often not a huge amount of pushback from the Muslim community at large. So, you know, I think that it can be hard to push back on Saudi influence from a mainstream point of view because the Hajj and so on are so central.
And finally, talk a little bit about how important it is to understand this project, what went on in the 60s and 70s, in understanding Saudi Arabia today. Yeah,
I mean, I think, first of all, it's not even just about understanding Saudi Arabia today. It's about understanding the world we live in today. It's a world in which, you know, after World War II, it really seems like a lot of these new countries were going to become pluralistic, liberal, progressive democracies. Maybe that was just a flash in the pan, but really for maybe a decade or more, it seemed like Nehru, Sukarno, Nasser, so on, all of these, you know, post-colonial leaders were creating new kinds of states. But then, one by one, all of these Muslim-majority countries turned out to be quite different. I mean, Indonesia today is democratic for sure, but religion is absolutely pervasive, and intolerance and kind of a more strident kind of Islam than had ever been there in its history before is pervasive in Indonesia today. In northern Nigeria, a dozen states have full-blown Sharia. And the thing is, did these things happen as an accident? Did these religious and conservative turns happen as an accident? To me, the answer is no. And you can't understand what happened in any of these countries if you don't understand the Saudi project and how influential it was. It's not an accident that this global Islamic consciousness displaced a lot of the progressive and democratic trends of the 20th century. And I think if you understand the Saudi project as this global phenomenon and really apprehend its reach and the resources devoted to it, you'll start to see patterns in how these countries developed. And in terms of Saudi Arabia today, I mean, I think, you know, it's one of the most important countries in the Middle East for sure, and it's part of the G20. But the way we talk about their foreign influence has been super vague, and I think this is a consequence of war on terror discourse, which tends to be really black and white and use phrases like axis of evil and so on. I don't think words like good and evil are useful for people interested in foreign affairs. I was really frustrated, in fact, that we didn't have a lot of specifics on quote-unquote Saudi money, even though people talked about it all the time. It was in the 9/11 Commission's report and so on. And I think the best way to fight that vagueness, which leads to bad decisions quite often, is to give a lot of specifics and detailed history.
Kritika Varga, her book is The Call, Inside the Global Saudi Religious Project. Kritika, I thank you so much for spending time with us here on the Who, What, Why podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on. This is great.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and for joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.